Hey, what's up, guys? So this video, in the next few videos, we're going to go over the movement basics that we have our athletes perform in the weight room. These 5 basic movement patterns that we're going to go over were popularized by Dan John. So the movement patterns that we're going to go over are the hip hinge, the squat, push, pull, and loaded carry. In this first video, we'll go over the hip hinge. In this video, we'll make this a 2-part series. So in this first series, we'll go over exactly what the hip hinge is and the importance of the hip hinge, why we do it. And then in the next video, we'll go over things like exercise technique, progressions and regressions and different exercises, things like that. Alright, so the first thing we'll go over is the hip hinge. So what is the hip hinge? So the hip hinge is exactly as its name suggests. The hip hinge is where the hip acts as a hinge or an axis of rotation between the upper body and the lower body. So basically, if we say that the picture on the left is position 1, and let's label position 2 here over on the right. So what a hip hinge would be is moving from position 1 into position 2 and then back into position 1. Again, try to focus on the hips. So if I can try to describe it using anatomical terms, I would say that a hip hinge is when you perform eccentric flexion of the hips while maintaining a neutral spine, slight flexion in the knees, and then from that position, it'll be followed by a rapid concentric hip extension back into position 1. So again, from position 1, you're going to bend at the hip, neutral spine, slight bend in the knee, and then from position 2, you're going to perform a rapid hip extension, finishing back into position 1, squeezing at the glutes. So what I just described there is what's known as a dynamic hip hinge. There's also something called a static hip hinge, where the athlete would simply hold position 2. As you can imagine, this position would be the position that the athlete would be in when performing any kind of rowing activities, a barbell bench over row, a Chinese row, pen lay rows, anything like that, where you hold this isometric position. And then the last type of hip hinge would be a squat hip hinge, which would be same thing. You would have that flexion in the hip in order to initiate the movement of the squat, but then obviously the squat would involve a lot more knee flexion in order to lower the weight. But we'll go over the squat in more detail later. So that's the basics of a hip hinge, basically bending at the hip as opposed to the low back, as you'll see pretty often. So we'll go over the examples again. So go here. So a good example of a dynamic hip hinge would be, again, anything that requires that eccentric flexion and then that concentric extension, that rapid concentric extension. A good example would be like an RDL or any kind of Olympic movements. Here we'll go over the kettlebell swing. So notice how she looks like what we discussed in position 1. So she'll move from position 1 into position 2 and then rapid concentric back into position 1. So here you go, you have the eccentric, rapid concentric, we'll try to play that again. But what you'll notice in this position here, this is position 2, so she has the hip flexion here. Notice how she maintains that neutral spine like we talked about, and then slight flexion in the knees. Alright, and then this would be a good example of a static hip hinge, where again you're in that position 2. You maintain position 2 while performing any kind of rowing activities. So notice you have that hip hinge, you have the neutral spine, and then the slight flexion in the knees. And then in this video, he's performing a barbell bench over row. So notice how he maintains that position, bending at the hip, not at the spine. And then this is an example of a squat hip hinge. So what he's doing in this video is hinging at the hips in order to initiate the squat movement. And then what you'll notice is that instead of maintaining the slight flexion in the knees, he has a lot more flexion in the knees in order to lower the weight into the squat. So he hinges at the hips, but after he hinges at the hips, he also hinges at the knees. And again, we'll go over the squat in more detail later. Moving forward. So what is the purpose of the hip hinge? Why do we do it? Why is it important that our athletes know how to properly hinge at the hips? Well, as we just went over, the hip hinge is an essential movement pattern for a lot of key exercises like the kettlebell swing, any kind of Olympic movements, the RDL, which you'll see a lot in our programming, any kind of rowing activities, the squat. And one of the reasons that our athletes need to know how to hip hinge other than just performing these exercises is in order to protect their what you'll notice with a lot of incoming freshmen is that they don't know how to hinge properly. When you ask them to perform any kind of movement that requires them to bend, what they'll do is they'll bend at the lumbar spine, which is a rounded back, which is probably something that you've seen, instead of bending at the hip. And if you've taken any kind of exercise physiology classes, then you'll be familiar with the flexion relaxation phenomenon that says that anytime you have flexion in the spine, you have relaxation of those larger back muscles, and your body would then rely on the ligaments in order to bear the load. And that's when the back injuries come, sore low backs and back tightness, things like that, that we really want to avoid that would prevent them from training. So that's one, we want them to learn how to bend properly at the hip instead of bending at the low lumbar spine. The other one, properly loading the hips, properly hinging at the hips allows you to properly load your posterior chain. You can properly load your glutes, properly load your hamstrings. For example, in the squat, as you've seen in the video, if you don't know how to properly hinge at the hips, you shouldn't be squatting at all. Like I said, learning that hip hinge allows you to load the glutes and the posterior chain. And if you don't know how to properly load the posterior chain, then what's going to happen is the other joints in the movement are going to compensate and take most of the stress for the movement, for example, the knees, and that's when you start getting knee pains and things like that. And again, safety's first. And then it kind of ties in with power. So if you can properly load your posterior chain, the glutes and the hamstrings, then you can properly develop the glutes and the hamstrings, get them stronger, get them more powerful, which we all know that's essential for athletic performance. So anything like jumping that requires the hip hinge coupled with that rapid concentric extension of the hips, anything like sprinting, accelerations, you can see the hip hinge in that. And so yeah, to recap what we went over, we just went over basically what the hip hinge is, which is bending at the hip. We talked about the dynamic hip hinge, static hip hinge, and then the squat hip hinge. Just remember that we want the athlete to maintain that neutral spine, maximal flexion in the hip, and then slight flexion in the knees, rapid concentric back into their position one. We went over a few examples, the kettlebell swing, the squat, any kind of rowing activities. And then a big reason why we want to teach the hip hinge is because of safety. We want to protect their low back, protect the knees in the squat, and then performance. So then properly develop the posterior chain. Get the athlete's glutes stronger, hamstrings stronger, so that they can perform. So for this video, I know it was brief. In the next video, we'll go over the exercise technique, common mistakes that you will see, and then how to fix it, and then progressions and regressions for a given exercise. So for your task, I would say, so I'm going to load up links for some videos involving the hip hinge. Just want you to watch it. Watch this video, and you'll learn how to not only hip hinge, but how to properly teach a hip hinge, and then we'll go over it more in the next video. But I want you to watch those videos and then try to perform it. And if you're adequate at performing a hip hinge, I want you to find somebody and try to teach it. All right, so In the next video, we'll go over the exercise techniques, so I'll see you in the next video.